Come on, speaker. Ah, okay, that didn't work. Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday. Sorry I couldn't get the music to work properly during the countdown. Same thing every day, and then one day it doesn't work. Hopefully I'll get that troubleshot by tomorrow. Let's light up the darkness. Okay, hold on a second. Gotta reload this. Okay. Who's in the house? Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandora in the Bronx, Paul in the Great Northwest, Yehud in South Carolina, Bella in Florida, Guy in Ohio, Lucy in Minnesota, Bill in Missouri, Lorraine in Texas, Joe in the Inland Empire. And over there on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Mickey in New Jersey, Spencer in Connecticut, Ella, Joseph in Nevada, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Guess what? With God's help, today we're going to finish chapter 3 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. We picked this up on page 60a. Our daf is page 60, daf samech, with Mishna number 10. A little bit, just a short way from the top on page 60a. Mishnah 10. A person may not open an entrance opposite another entrance, or a window opposite another window toward a courtyard belonging to partners. A continuation of what we were discussing yesterday. Two partners have houses opening onto a courtyard, so they co-own the courtyard. You would think that you could just do whatever you want since you're an owner of the courtyard. Create another window, create another door. So we saw no, you can't. You're going to have to get permission from your partner. And even with permission, you're not going to open it if your door that opens into the courtyard is going to be looking right into the door of your partner's house across the courtyard. Your partner's in the courtyard. He has his house. You have your house. But you can't add a door, I think even with his permission, where it's going to be right opposite his door, because we don't want to live in such a way that people in this house could look straight over into the entranceway of that house. And this reflects the modesty of the Jewish people. And this is so as to ensure that the residents will enjoy a measure of privacy. If there was a small entrance, he may not enlarge it. If there was one entrance, he may not fashion it into two entrances. There'll be some nuance to this. But one may open an entrance opposite another entrance, or a window opposite another window toward the public domain. And similarly, if there was a small entrance, he may enlarge it. And if there was one entrance, he may fashion it into two. And that is because if your house opens into the public domain, okay, so there's already an expectation that people walking down the street can look into your house. So it's just not that big a deal that, you could then, look across the street and the entrance of your neighbor's house across the street is directly opposite your front door, because already you'd employ privacy measures like keeping your front door closed and not putting things that require privacy right inside the front door, because anybody walking down the street could see in. And so the same idea of protecting privacy doesn't exist when already the entrance is opening onto the private domain. And that's different than an entrance that opens into a private domain. I said public domain for the street. And that's different than an entrance that opens into a private domain like a courtyard. This is Mishnah number 10. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters, i.e. that one may not open an entrance opposite another entrance or a window opposite another window, derived? And this should sound familiar. And from the title of our show today, Rabbi Yochanan says that the verse states, and Bilam, right, the prophet, the non-Jewish prophet Bilam, who was invited by the king Balak to curse the Jewish people. And he said, look, I can only say what God tells me to say. If God instructs me to bless, I'll bless. If he instructs me to curse, I'll curse. He was brought to curse the Jewish people, and he ended up blessing the Jewish people not once, but several times. And part of that blessing is something that we Jews repeat every time we enter a synagogue for a prayer service. Ma tovu ochalecha Yaakov mishkenasecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. That's something that Bilam said when he came to curse and ended up blessing, right? And here it says, the verse Numbers 24:2, and Bilam lifted up his eyes. And what did he see that led him to issue this blessing? Bilam lifted up his eyes and he saw Israel dwelling tribe by tribe. And then the Spirit of God came upon him and he issued that blessing that I just said. And what did he see that inspired him? He saw that the entrances of the tents of the children of Israel in the wilderness were not aligned with each other, ensuring that each family enjoyed a measure of privacy. And he said, if this is the case, these people are worthy of having the divine presence rest on them. This whole concept of modesty and keeping private things private, it's obviously not only a Jewish concept. Many cultures and religions have a concept of modesty. But really what's at the root of that is this idea of we're going to overcome our base urges, right? I mean, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, a big part of the evil inclination is sexual. And just creates desire out of that which we see. And we shouldn't be lusting after somebody who's not permitted to us, right? Who can we lust after? Our spouse, healthy lust. We shouldn't be coveting, like the 10th commandment. We shouldn't be coveting that which does not belong to us, like our neighbor's wife, like some other person that's not permitted to us. And so we don't want to cast our eyes upon them either. And so we create habits and situations that will reinforce that modesty and that guarding of the eyes, starting with the way that we line up our homes and align our entrances so that we're not looking into the dwellings of others. Now, the Mishnah teaches that if there was a small entrance, he may not enlarge it. Rami Bar Chama thought to say this means that if the entrance was the width of 4 cubits, one may not fashion it to the height of 8 cubits, as he would then be allowed to take 8 corresponding cubits in the courtyard. So this the halacha is that one is entitled to utilize the area of a courtyard up to a depth of 4 cubits along the width of the opening. In other words, whenever you have a door opening into a courtyard, even though you share that courtyard with others, you have a kind of area around your door which belongs only to you. Like that place where you're going to put the welcome mat, where you could put an umbrella stand, where you could put shoes that are going to be wet that you don't want to bring in the house, etc. You have an area around the door that is yours and yours alone, and that is per door. that opens into the courtyard. So if you took a single door and split it into two, suddenly you would create a double area because each door gets that 4 by 4 cubits, and that's why they're preventing you from doing that. But if the entrance was the width of 2 cubits, and one wishes to fashion it to the width of 4 cubits, one may well do so, as in any event, he already had the right to use an area of 4 cubits by 4 cubits in front of the entrance. And Rava said to him, no, this is not so, as his neighbor can say to him, I can conceal myself from you with there being a small entrance, but I cannot conceal myself from you with there being a large entrance. In other words, enlarging the entrance of the house into the courtyard may create a privacy problem, and that's something that your partner in owning the courtyard could object to, and if he does object, you're not going to be allowed to do it. Or you're going to have to negotiate to pay a price. Now, the Mishnah teaches that if there was one entrance, he may not fashion it into two. So in this case as well, Rabbi Bar Chama thought to say that this means if the entrance was the width of 4 cubits, he may not make it into 2 openings, each the width of 2 cubits, as he would then be allowed to take 8 corresponding cubits in the courtyard, 4 for each entrance. But if it was already the width of 8 cubits and he wishes to make it into 2 openings, each the width of 4 cubits, then he may well do so, as in any event. He already had the right to use an area of 8 cubits by 4 cubits in front of his entrance. And Rava said to him, no, this is not so. As his neighbor can say to him, I can conceal myself from you with there being one entrance, but I cannot conceal myself from you with there being 2 entrances. Again, having a double door can create additional privacy issues. And the Mishnah teaches, but one may open an entrance opposite another entrance or a window opposite another window if it faces the public domain. And why is this so? Because he can say to the one who wishes to protest, ultimately, you must conceal yourself from the people of the public domain, since you cannot stop them from passing by, and therefore you cannot engage in behavior that requires privacy with your entrance open. It is of no consequence to you if I open an entrance as well. That's why I don't have to worry that my door is going to end up right directly opposite my neighbor's door who lives across the street, because between us there is the public domain. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 10 here in chapter 3. Now, Mishnah 11. One may not form an empty space beneath the public domain by digging pits, ditches, or caves. Baruch Hashem, thank God. We don't want people going out in the road and digging a pit or creating a cave under the thoroughfare where people pass by. Obviously, that's going to be a major hazard. Rabbi Eliezer, however, deems it permitted for one to do so, provided that he places a covering strong enough that a wagon loaded up with stones would be able to tread on it without breaking it, therefore ensuring that the empty space will not cause any damage to those in the public domain. So a wagon laden with stones, this would represent the heaviest thing that's going to go rolling down that street in the ancient world. And so he made a pit at some kind of a hole in the public domain, but he covered it up with such a strong cover that no one will ever be damaged by it because it's strong enough for the heaviest possible burden to roll over it. So maybe in today's understanding, an 18-wheeler filled with, or like a gasoline tanker truck, filled with liquid, incredibly heavy item, very dense, could roll over the cover of this hole. Or perhaps, thinking ahead that God forbid there should be a battle and a tent. You know what? I think that an 18-wheeler laden with fuel or water would be about the heaviest thing that could roll down the street. Let me know if you could think of something heavier. And if even that is not going to, the cover of this pit that you dug is going to have no problem holding it, so then what's the problem? Are we saying that we're behaving with the behavior characteristic of the residents of Sodom? That it's not going to hurt anybody, but we're going to prevent this guy from digging a pit that might be useful to him? And that seems to be Rabbi Eliezer's opinion and his perspective. And yet his was the minority opinion that was overruled by the majority. And can you guess why? Can you imagine why? Let's see. Let's just give it away. We're going to come to it in the Gemara, but I'm not finished with the Mishnah yet. Because that cover could wear out. The cover could become damaged. And the person who put it there maybe isn't being careful, doesn't maintain it, just left it covered and moved away. And then when the strength of the cover becomes eroded over time, now that hole under the public thoroughfare resumes its status as a terrible public hazard. And to avoid that ever happening in the future, the sages said, yeah, we don't dig pits and ditches and caves under a public thoroughfare. Okay, let's continue with the Mishnah. One may not extend projections or balconies into the public domain. Rather, if he desired to build one, he may draw back into his property by moving his wall and then extend the projection to the end of his property line, right? So in other words, you want to have a balcony outside your bedroom, your upstairs bedroom? Sure, you can have a balcony outside of your bedroom, but if that balcony is going to extend over the public domain and possibly cause a hazard to the public, you can't do it. You want to have a balcony outside of your bedroom? Okay, so bring the outer wall of your bedroom inward and then leave the balcony out there. Make your bedroom smaller and then you'll have a balcony outside. But you can't project your balcony out into the public space. Okay, but rather if he desired to build one, he may draw back into his property by moving his wall and extend the projection to the end of his property line, that where the wall stood before. And if one purchased a courtyard in which there are projections and balconies extending into the public domain, this courtyard retains its presumptive status, i.e. the owner has the acquired privilege of their use, and the court does not demand their removal. You know, it's like you bought it. The public didn't object when the prior owner had these balconies extending into the public domain, and so it sounds like you can keep it because you bought it and you acquired the privilege that the previous owner seemed to enjoy. That's Mishnah number 11. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, regarding Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, right, that it is permitted to dig ditches and caves under the public thoroughfare as long as you cover them. Regarding Rabbi Eliezer's opinion that if the covering of the space is strong enough to support a wagon laden with stones, then it is permitted to dig out the empty space. This is eminently reasonable, but what do the rabbis, meaning the majority, hold? And the Gemara answers, there are times when the cover erodes over time, and the one who dug the ditch is not aware that his cover has eroded, thereby potentially causing damage to those in the public domain. Our Mishnah also taught that one may not extend projections or balconies into the public domain. So the Gemara relates, Rabbi Ami had a projection that protruded into an alleyway. Now, an alleyway is different than a public domain. An alleyway is basically owned, or has the rights of usage in it are the people whose courtyards open into the alleyway, not the public at large. So that's different than regular public domain. Okay, Rabbi Ami had a projection that protruded into an alleyway, and a certain man also had a projection, but his protruded into the public domain. And the general public was preventing the man from leaving it there as it interfered with traffic. They were telling him he has to get rid of his projection. So he came before Rabbi Ami, who said to him, you need to remove your projection. So of course the man said to Rabbi Ami, but the master also has a similar projection. And Rabbi Ami said to him, it is different, as mine protrudes into an alleyway, where a limited number of people live, and the residents of the alleyway have waived their right to protest to me. Your projection protrudes into the public domain, which does not belong to any specific individuals, who can waive their right to protest to you. And the Gemara relates, Rabbi Yanai had a tree that was leaning into the public domain, and there was a certain man who also had a tree that was leaning into the public domain. And the general public was preventing him from leaving it there, insisting that he cut it down as required by our Mishna on page 27b. And he came before Rabbi Yanai and said to him, Rabbi Yanai said to him, go now and come tomorrow, right? I want to think over this question, so come back for a ruling tomorrow. That night, Rabbi Yanai sent, and he had someone cut down his own tree that was leaning into the public domain. The next day, the man came before Rabbi Yanai, who said to him, go cut down your tree. And the man said to him, but the master also has a tree that leans into the public domain. And Rabbi Yanai said to him, go and see. If mine is cut down, then cut yours down. If mine is not cut down, you do not have to cut yours down either. And of course, Rabbi Yanai knew that his tree had already been cut down so that he could be consistent and not at all hypocritical when he told this guy, you got to cut down your tree because it's interfering with the public. The Gemara asks, at the outset, what did Rabbi Yanai hold? And ultimately, what did he hold? I mean, he had a tree leaning into the public domain. Why is it that he allowed that to stand until somebody else had a similar issue that the public was objecting to it? And the Gemara replies, at the outset, he held that the general public is amenable to having the tree there as they can sit in its shade. But once he saw that they were preventing someone else who owned the tree from keeping his, he understood that it was only out of respect to him as the local sage that people were not objecting to his tree being there. So he therefore sent someone to cut it down. And the Gemara asked, but why did he tell the man to return the next day? Why not say to him, go cut down your tree and then I will cut mine down? And the Gemara answers, because of the statement of Reish Lakish, who said that the verse states, gather yourselves together and gather. This is from Zephaniah 2:1. And that verse can be explained homiletically to mean adorn yourself and afterward adorn others. Yeah, sometimes we say those in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, a little bit reverse, right? But before you go lecture somebody else on what they should be doing, make sure that you are following that same principle. Now, the Mishna teaches that one may not extend projections or balconies into the public domain. And rather, if you desire to build one, he should draw back into his property by moving his wall, right, making his house a little smaller, and then he can extend a balcony or a projection out to his to the property line where his wall used to stand. And a dilemma was raised before the sages. If one drew back into his property, but he did not extend the projection at that time, what is the law concerning whether he may return and extend it at a later date? And Rabbi Yochanan says if one drew back into his property, he may extend it even later. It's his property. Okay, he's making less use of his property for the footprint of his home because he was thinking about extending a balcony out to the property line. He hasn't done that yet. Then maybe after he shrinks brings the wall back, he says to himself, you know what, I preferred having the larger courtyard or the larger house. So now he wants to just go back to his original property line. Why wouldn't he be able to do that? Answer, well, if he drew back the wall inside of the property line and it was that way for a while and the public got used to using that space where his wall used to stand, perhaps the public acquired a privilege of having that space added to the public domain. That's the question that's being asked and debated right now. So Rabbi Yochanan says that if one drew back into his property, he may extend it even later. And Reish Lakish says if one drew back into his property but did not build a projection at that time, he may not extend it later. So the Gemara presents an alternative version of the dispute. Rabbi Yaakov said to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, I will explain the matter to you. To later extend a projection, everyone agrees that he may extend it since he is adding within his own property. Where they disagree is with regard to whether he may return the walls to their prior place. And with regard to this disagreement, the opposite was stated. Rabbi Yochanan says he may not return the walls to their prior place, and Reish Lakish says that he may return them. And Rabbi Yaakov explains their reasoning. Rabbi Yochanan says that he may not return the walls to their prior place because of the statement of Rav Yehuda. As Rav Yehuda says, with regard to a path that the public has established as a public thoroughfare, it is prohibited to ruin it, i.e. to prevent people from using it. Once the public has become accustomed to using the place where his wall used to stand, he may not repossess that space. And Reish Lakish says that he may return the walls to their prior place because that matter applies in a case where there is no space, i.e. if he were to move back the wall, there would be no space for the public to walk. But here there is a space since they can still walk through the public domain. In other words, if you made an opening on your property and that created a path that didn't exist before, you didn't just widen the existing public domain, but you actually created some kind of like a pass-through,
that enables people to have a shortcut to get from one road to another, etc., and then they become accustomed to using that. Now you're not going to be able to build out again and stop them from taking that path. But if you brought in your wall because you were thinking about adding a balcony, and then you thought about it and you said, you know what, even though it's been a few years, I never did build a balcony, I want to bring my wall back out to where it was. Or even if you did build a balcony, and then you decided, you know, and people were walking under it, but then you said, you know what, I want to build my wall back to where it was. Well, during that period, when you had brought your wall into your property, well, that happened was you widened the public domain. Okay, so now it's not going to be quite as wide, but it's not changing anybody's progress from the in terms of the directions that they were taking to get home or to get where they were going. They could still walk down that street, and that's why it's permitted for you to reclaim what is your own property in any case. Now, the Mishnah teaches that if one purchased a courtyard in which there are projections and balconies extending into the public domain, this courtyard retains its presumptive status, allowing the owner to use those projections. And Rav Huna says if the wall of the courtyard fell, he may return and build it as it was, including the projections or the balconies. But the Gemara raises an objection, right? So if you bought this property that somebody else extended into the public domain, and perhaps people could have objected and he shouldn't have been able to do it, but he did it and no one objected, and then it was just that way for years, and then you bought that property from the previous owner, we're saying you have a presumptive ownership over that balcony as it is, and you can keep it there. Okay, then let's say there was an earthquake and this thing falls down and you want to rebuild it. So do you still have the right to rebuild now that it's going to be your construction and not the prior owner's construction that's going to extend out into the public domain? The Gemara seems to say, and the Mishnah seems to say, yes, you can do that. But now the Gemara is going to challenge that. So the Gemara raises an objection based on that which is taught in a Baraisa. One may not plaster, and one may not tile, and one may not paint images in the present as a sign of mourning for the destruction of the temple. Right? So in the early days after the destruction of the temple, the second temple, so the sages decreed that there were going to be some practices that are going to sort of institutionalize national mourning. Right? Our lives should never be the same as they were before the temple was destroyed. We should be constantly aware that there are now hundreds of mitzvahs that we are unable to fulfill because the temple has been removed from our midst. Right? And of course, that's why we have Tisha B'Av and the saddest day on the Jewish calendar that we observed, and the long fast that we observed last week. And there are other practices as well. Something that we're going to get to later in the page today is that when somebody builds or renovates a house, who's an observant Jew, what they will do is leave a kind of 1 square cubit area of a wall inside the house in a visible place, often behind the door, like where the door opens, unpainted. You know, saying that their house is unfinished just because this one spot on the wall has not been painted. And this we do to remind ourselves constantly that, oh, we don't have the temple in our midst. Our joy can never be complete. So in the early days, shortly after the temple had been destroyed, people were taking this kind of national mourning quite seriously and were adopting much more stringent, much more difficult practices, as we shall see. So one of them was, you could build a house, but you can't even plaster it, right? Like you can't finish the walls at all, not just in a 1 cubit area, but you have to leave the walls unfinished everywhere. I mean, obviously, they're going to be sealed against the cold, etc., but there are going to be certain treatments that are not going to be permissible because they would be deemed too nice, right? Better we should live a slightly rougher type of house and always be reminded that the temple has been removed from our midst. So, one may not plaster, and one may not tile, and one may not paint images in the present as a sign of mourning for the destruction of the temple. But if one purchased a courtyard that was plastered or tiled or painted with these kinds of images, so this courtyard retains its presumptive status, and it is assumed that it was done in a permitted manner. Either there was some dispensation from the rabbis, or it was built before the temple was destroyed. So if it then fell, he may not return and build it in its previous form. Now that it's new construction, as it were, because even though it's a replacement building, now he has to leave something of it unfinished, and he has to follow these practices. And back at ancient times, even the heavier practices of leaving it unfinished in recognition of the destruction of the temple. So why doesn't he acquire the presumptive privilege of rebuilding it the same way that it was when he didn't have to leave it in this unfinished state? And the Gemara answers, a case of forbidden matters is different. I.e., in the case of the Baraisa, he may not rebuild it because it is prohibited for him to do so. In this Mishnah, the issue is encroachment upon the rights of others. And once he had an acquired privilege to use the projections or balconies, he maintains that right. That's as distinguished from building in such a way that it violates a halacha of remaining ever mindful of the destruction of the temple. Now, with regard to the ruling of this above quoted Baraisa, the sages taught a person may not plaster his house with plaster, but if he mix sand or straw into the plaster, which dulls its luster, then it is permitted, right? So again, he could seal the house. It's going to be proper construction, but he's not going to be able to use certain bright colors, certain really smooth finishes. It has to be like a little bit less than what it could be. Again, in recognition of the destruction of the temple. So Rabbi Yehuda says if you mix sand into it, it is white cement, which is of a higher quality than standard plaster, and it is prohibited. But if he mixed it with straw, then it is permitted. Again, there are different definitions of what kind of lackluster, right? What kind of luster he needs to lack in order to recognize the destruction. Now, having mentioned the prohibition against plastering, which is a sign of mourning over the destruction of the temple, the Gemara now is going to discuss some related matters, and with this, we're going to come to the end of the chapter. So the sages taught in a Baraisa, when the temple was destroyed a second time, there was an increase in the number of ascetics among the Jews whose practice was to not eat meat and to not drink wine. They gave up a lot. Why did they do that? Because the temple had been destroyed. Rabbi Yehoshua joined them to discuss their practice, and he said to them, "My children, for what reason do you not eat meat and do you not drink wine?" And they said to him, "Shall we eat meat, from which offerings are sacrificed upon the altar, and now the altar has ceased to exist? Shall we drink wine, which is poured as a libation upon the altar, and now the altar has ceased to exist?" And Rabbi Yehoshua said to them, "If so, we will not eat bread either, since the meal offerings that were offered upon the altar have ceased." And they replied, "Oh, you're right. It is possible to subsist with produce. We won't eat bread." So he said to them, "Well, we cannot eat produce either, since the bringing of the first fruits have ceased." So they replied, "You're right. So we will no longer eat the produce of the 7 species from which the first fruits were brought, as it is possible to subsist with other produce." He said to them, "If so, we will not drink water, since the water libation has ceased." And they were silent, as they realized that they could not survive without water. So Rabbi Yehoshua said to them, "My children, come and I will tell you how we should act. To not mourn at all is impossible, as the decree was already issued and the temple has been destroyed. We must mourn. But to mourn excessively, as you are doing, is also impossible, as the sages do not issue a decree upon the public unless a majority of the public is able to abide by it. As it is written, Malachi 3:9, "You are cursed with the curse, yet you rob me, even this whole nation." And this indicates that the prophet rebukes the people for neglecting observances only if those observances were accepted by the whole nation. So at times there were sages who issued decrees that they wanted to take root throughout the nation, and it didn't work. The people kind of rejected it. They just wouldn't follow it, and then they withdrew those edicts. Right, so the edicts that we have, the halachas that we follow, are laws that the sages, I'm talking about rabbinic laws, rabbinic decrees, those are ones that they issued, and the nation of Israel, Am Yisrael, adopted them. Right, and if the nation didn't adopt them, then we don't follow them. Now Rabbi Yehoshua continues. So Rabbi Yehoshua continues. So this is what the sages said. A person may plaster his house with plaster, but he must leave over a small amount in it without plaster to remember the destruction of the temple. And how much is a small amount? And Rav Yosef said, 1 cubit by 1 cubit. And Rav Chisda said there should be, this unfinished area of 1 cubit by 1 cubit should be opposite the entrance so that it is visible to all. And Rabbi Yehoshua continues, the sages said that a person may prepare all that he needs for a meal, but he must leave out a small item to remember the destruction of the temple. And the Gemara interjects, what is this small item? And Rav Papa said something akin to a small dried fish. Now, this is a law. Here's the halacha on this. In commemoration of the destruction of the temple, it was instituted that when one prepares a meal, including guests, he should leave out a small item and allow that place on the table to remain without the appropriate dish. It's like you should, if you have like an assortment of dips, sounds like among the assortment of dips, there should be an empty bowl in commemoration of the destruction of the temple. This maybe requires further research, but that seems to be what it says. Rabbi Yehoshua continues, the sages said that a woman may engage in all of her cosmetic treatments, but she must leave out a small matter to remember the destruction of the temple. And the Gemara interjects, what is this small matter? And Rav said she does not remove hair from the place on the temple from which woman would remove hair. And the source for these practices is a verse, as it is stated, Psalm 137, if I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its cunning, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I remember you not, if I set not Jerusalem above my highest joy. And of course, highest joy would indicate a wedding. And that's why we break a glass at a wedding, so that even at those moments of highest joy, we do remember the destruction of Jerusalem, the loss of the temple, the loss of the altar, etc. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of above my highest joy? And Rav Yitzchak says this is referring to the burnt ashes that are customarily placed on the head, the rosh, of bridegrooms at the time of their wedding celebrations to remember the destruction of the temple. Apparently that's been replaced by the glass. Rav Papa said to Abaye, where are they placed? And Abaye replied that they used to place these ashes on the place where the tefillin are placed, as it is stated, to appoint to them that mourn in Zion, to give to them a garland in place of ashes, Isaiah 61:3. Since tefillin are referred to as a garland from Ezekiel 24:17, it may be inferred from this verse that the ashes were placed in the same place as the phylacteries. Now the Baraisa continues, and anyone who, this very, very key line, it occurs in a bunch of places in the Talmud, I'm pretty sure, but it's definitely occurring right here, so pay special attention. We've encountered this before, I know it's in other places. The Baraisa continues, and anyone who mourns for the destruction of Jerusalem will merit and see its joy. As it is stated, rejoice with Jerusalem and be glad with her, all that love her. Rejoice for joy with her, all that mourn for her. Right? So those who bring themselves to genuine emotion, when we think about all that's been lost, all the Jews that have become disconnected from Torah and from Judaism, all of the practices that were gone once the temple was destroyed, there's so much to mourn for as a nation, not even getting into all the times that we've been attacked, etc. But right now we're just talking about the loss of Jerusalem as it was when the temple stood there, and the Sanhedrin, was giving Torah rulings over the nation. We were living at a much different and more exalted status. We have to be able to mourn for the loss of that, and if we do, will merit to see the joy of Jerusalem. In other words, will merit to be there when Mashiach comes, either in our lifetimes or if it's, if we're sadly have passed away at that point, we will enjoy the resurrection of the dead and be able to be there when Mashiach comes, and all are dancing for joy in the reconstituted Jerusalem with the third temple. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. It is taught in a Baraisa, the Tosefta, Tractate Sota, 1510, that Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha said, from the day that the temple was destroyed, by right, we should decree upon ourselves not to eat meat and not drink wine.
But the sages do not issue a decree upon the public unless a majority of the public is able to abide by it. And from the day that the wicked kingdom, this means Rome, from the day that the wicked kingdom spread, who decree evil and harsh decrees upon us and nullify Torah study and the performance of commandments for us, and do not allow us to enter the celebration of the first week of a son, i.e. his circumcision, and some say to enter the celebration of the salvation of a firstborn son, the redemption of the firstborn, which is a ritual we do for when a woman's firstborn is a son. There's a redemption of the firstborn unless the father is a Levite or a Cohen. So this was something that the Romans prohibited. Circumcision, they prohibited. Redemption of the firstborn. So by right, we should decree upon ourselves not to marry a woman and not to produce offspring. And it will turn out that the descendants of Abraham, our father, will cease to exist on their own rather than being forced into a situation where there are sons who are not circumcised, right? So it would be better, according to this, for a Jew not to be born at all than to be born and not be circumcised. That's actually not what we hold because we treasure life, but we understand how serious it would be if circumcision was prevented. But concerning a situation such as this, the following principle is applied. Leave the Jews alone and do not impose decrees by which they cannot abide. It is better that they be unwitting sinners who do not know that what they are doing is improper, considering the circumstances, rather than they should do it anyway and become intentional wrongdoers who marry and procreate despite knowing that they should not. Right? And that's an interesting general principle. There are just so many Jews out there who don't even know all of the transgressions they're committing constantly because they've just been disconnected for several generations. It's a tragic state, but that's why outreach is so important. And that concludes our chapter 3. Here, our journey through chapter 3 here in Tractate Bava Basra. And with God's help, tomorrow, Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, we will open chapter 4. Okay, looks like one question from Sharon. I tried to ask this yesterday. I have a real problem with the idea that a neighbor can tell someone what to do with their own home because of how they might use it. I used to live in an apartment in Philadelphia that had a big bowed window that looked out into a very narrow alley and into my neighbor's big bowed window. Private solution? Curtains. I mean, there's nothing wrong with your solution. So first of all, is that alley really a private alley or is it a public thoroughfare? So if it's a public domain, as we see, you can look across it, no problem. If it's more private, then maybe it'd be better not to. But who's your neighbor? Right? Is your neighbor another Jew who is, following Torah law like you do? Is the law of the land different than Torah? Is there a contradiction? So it's not so simple. Obviously, curtains go a long way. I would think that they had curtains back then, but probably they didn't have curtain rods quite the same way we do now. They didn't have the same kind of hardware. I'm sure that's some kind of hardware. So, in terms of in any particular situation, check with your rabbi. I think the takeaway is how important it is to be modest. I mean, I remember when I lived in the city, it's crazy, right? Rear window situation like the Jimmy Stewart movie. You look out the rear window at another building across the alley and, there's just like dozens of apartments. Most people are modest. Some people seemingly want to put on a show and, just walking around there like, hey, look at me. Some people don't think about it, but should think about it. So modesty is a value and a virtue that we prize. Sharon also says, one of the texts I was involved in studying on Tisha B'Av was Psalm 137. That includes that line about forgetting Jerusalem, a perfect text to study on Tisha B'Av. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, tomorrow, Monday, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.